Hi and good afternoon to our second Reboot live stream, our second Reboot interview. Today we have John Bunzl here. He is the founder and the leading light behind Simpol, a campaign and organization that is advocating for simultaneous policy around the world. What exactly that means, John will tell us in a few minutes. But let me say just a little bit about John. John is a businessman. He's based in the UK, and he founded Simpol in 2000 and has since developed this into an impressive machine around the world with over 100 countries involved, essentially providing a tool for governments, for politicians, but also most importantly for citizens, to push global agendas locally. Now, I can see now that John has come into the waiting room. I will invite him in and say hello to him. Okay, John, hello. How are you doing? Are you coming on board? There you are. Good afternoon, John.
Hi.
I just said a few words about you. That you have founded Simpol in 2000 and that you have since built this into an international operation with supporters around the world, that you're providing quite a simple tool for politicians and citizens alike to push and to move forward global agendas that very often get gridlocked because of competing interests. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, where you're coming from, how you got to develop this idea, and well, where you are now.
Well, the idea came to me back in 1998. Just when my background is in international business. I've just recently retired from a company that trades in polyester fibers for bedding and various other applications. And towards the end of 98, I was just having a Sunday lunch with my family and my kids, and my mum was there. My kids were talking about climate change because they were covering it at school. And at the end of the meal, my mum, bless her, turned around to me and said, "Well, John, what would you do about climate change?" Nice question. But I just had this sort of light bulb insight in that moment of challenge. And I think it's my business background that led me. I just responded, it would have to happen simultaneously. And
when you say it has to happen simultaneously, what exactly has to happen simultaneously?
Well, the implementation of actions to stop climate change or to solve other global problems needs to be implemented by all or sufficient nations simultaneously.
Why is that? Why is that?
Why? Because if any nation, because in a globalized economy where capital moves at the click of a computer mouse from one side of the world to the other in a couple of microseconds, if one country moves ahead to cut its emissions, and to do that, it would have to raise taxes on its businesses, it would have to increase environmental regulations. But if that country moves first, then its businesses will become uncompetitive because they'll have to higher costs than their competitors elsewhere. And that will just cause those jobs or those companies to move elsewhere. So you have this vicious circle going on where nobody wants to move first. And that is exactly why you get the problem we have with the COP26 and these continual repeated international summits where nothing really happens, or there's only insufficient action.
You have sort of termed you've created this term for this. You talk about destructive global competition, I believe. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we call it DGC, destructive global competition, which is really just this vicious circle where no nation wants to move first for fear of harming its economy or harming its, in the case of nuclear weapons, harming its military competitiveness, if you like.
But as a businessman, you would probably say that competition in itself is a good thing, wouldn't you?
Well, this is the point. I think this is the brainwashing. Competition and cooperation can be either negative or positive. It can be either destructive or constructive. So you can have negative, or you can have destructive cooperation. So, for example, if competitors in a particular industry get together in a cafe in Zurich who secretly agree an increase in prices, that's destructive cooperation.
Okay,
so, in fact,
so
competition or cooperation can be, they need each other. Sporting competition, like a game of tennis, you have the competition, but you have the cooperation of the rules and the umpires and the line judges and Hawkeye. That's the cooperative framework that keeps the competition. You don't have the cooperation, the competition soon becomes destructive. And that's the problem we have in the global economy today. We have a globalized economy. Corporations and companies and international crime syndicates and carbon emissions can move globally and freely. But governance, the cooperation, doesn't exist because we have 200-odd nations, global competition dynamic. And that's exactly why we need simultaneous implementation to build that cooperative global framework within which the global economy can once again become constructive, sustainable, and so forth, and reasonably.
Okay, so you started from a quite a simple idea, but you're basically saying, well, you know, we have to, in a way, move forward in concert, because if one player moves first, he will incur additional costs under a more stringent regulatory framework, and that kind of prevents him from doing so. But if they would all move at the same time, they would all incur the same constraints, and so competition would be fair again. Now, this is a brilliant idea, and you started with this idea, what, nearly 20 years ago, I believe. In fact, over 20 years ago. And it just shows, you know, you have a great idea, and it takes an awful long time to go from a very simple idea to what could be quite a complex implementation. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey that you have covered, and also the different components that make up the simple kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, well, in terms of the journey, Nico, my first impulse when I had this idea was that it was potentially tremendously powerful and important. But my first thought was, well, somebody else must have thought of this before. And so I did a lot of reading and research, and I found that actually nobody had thought of this before. My next thought was, well, I'm a businessman. I don't know about campaigns and politics. I know what, I'll go and talk to Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and the big non-governmental, you know, the big NGOs. But to my disappointment, they just didn't get it. They didn't really, I think it's because they don't really understand the way the global economy works. They don't understand the constraints, the competitive constraints that politicians and businesses, for that matter too, are under. So I think they tend to think, oh, well, you know, if so-and-so is in power, they have the power to solve climate change. But that's just, you know, they don't, because no country can ignore what every other country is doing. And you know, so I had to really start the thing from scratch. And it also took time to really develop the idea into a workable campaign, which is now on our website, simpol.org. And we have various national websites as well. So, but I mean, the other barrier to the idea being taken up, and I think probably the biggest barrier, Nico.
Let's for a moment. Let's just stick.
What is consciousness.
Yeah, let's just stick with this first barrier for a moment, because I found this fascinating. If you have an idea, you would imagine that NGOs who are there to make the world a better place would jump at it, and your experience was that they didn't, that the business model, if you know, for the lack of a better word, was alien to them. They operate on a different basis. Essentially, the very core of what you're I believe what you're proposing is that you're coming from a business perspective. So you're fundamentally not anti-business. But what you are saying is you know, if you apply a business methodology, competitive thinking to a kind of a political environment, then we instantly see the kind of thoughts that both business leaders and politicians will have when they have to contemplate a first move. So you're coming to it purely from a sort of a problem-solving, collaborative perspective, rather than sort of saying, well, you know, we are the good guys, we want the good world, and other people should kind of be a bit more like us. Isn't that? Or how would you phrase
that's
that?
Absolutely right. Because I think when you understand the way the global economy works and how powerful the movements of global capital and investment are, and what effect they have on jobs and investment in this or that country, you realize how, you know, it's not that politicians have power, politicians are in a straitjacket. You know, so what you realize is that it's not that politicians don't want to solve climate change and other global problems, it's that they can't. You know, destructive global competition has them locked in. So that's not to say that they can't make any move, but that the moves they can make are, or are incremental. But we all know that we need really big moves, and that you will only get through simultaneous implementation, in my view, whereby everybody knows that everybody is moving together. But that's a completely different, as you say, it's a completely different mindset to the NGOs, who don't understand about the competitive environment, and therefore they just think if we just shout loud enough and if we just protest enough, the government will do what we want. And the reality is the governments can't. And that indeed is why over the last 30, 40 years, when you're as old as we are, Nico, or me at least, you've
Speak
seen,
for yourself.
I'm 64 now. You've seen, the Battle of Seattle. You've seen the protests against the World Trade Organization. You've seen Occupy. You've seen it all. And the global justice movement has really made, I won't say zero impact, but zero significant impact on things. You know, we just keep on going on with these ridiculous protests, blaming and shaming, and it's just not getting to the real nub of the issue, which is destructive global competition.
Well, I think there is a lot. I think a lot of the blaming and shaming, to be fair, has to do with the sense of frustration of, you know, not moving. So I think what you are saying is actually we can move beyond blaming and shaming, and we can use a methodology that allows us to implement sort of key changes. So the first kind of big hurdle on your journey you encountered was the sort of the resistance, or the kind of the lack of buy-in from NGOs. So what did you do next?
So then we've started the campaign ourselves, and really we're still in a position where the very few people who do see things the way we see them will join us, and we are just building, you know, slowly with different national coordinators in different countries, but it's a very informal setup. And it's really all word of mouth and using, electronic, internet and all the rest, and social media. So we are just trying to get our message across. But I think what also the NGOs don't realize is that Simpol is incredibly politically powerful. Because when you realize that politicians are stuck and that your vote has become, you know, fairly meaningless, at least as far as global issues are concerned, you release yourself from this idea that politicians have power, and you realize that they don't have power. So you can have a little fun with your vote. So instead of saying, I will vote for this party or that party, Labour or Conservative or Democrat or Republican, we citizens can turn around and say, do you know what, Mr. Politician, Mrs. Politician, I will give strong preference to any politician or party within reason that signs the pledge to implement the simultaneous policy. And in that way, we are turning things around 180 degrees, and we're bringing all the existing politicians and parties into really stiff competition with each other. And as you know, Nico, many parliamentary seats and even entire elections these days are being won and lost on actually very fine margins. So if you have this growing block of Simpol supporters who are prepared to vote for any politician or party within reason that signs up to Simpol, then, or at least to make that politicians aware of that, then you bring them into competition. And we have found on many occasions, in many elections, that particularly in those marginal seats, if we get one candidate to sign up, then the next one signs up, then the next one, then the next one. And so we have all the competing candidates have signed the Simpol pledge. So whoever wins the seat, we have another member of parliament committed to implementing Simpol alongside other.
So let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. So say there was a specific policy to do with, for example, meeting certain targets, certain climate targets, but very tangible. So that you say, we commit to reducing CO2 emissions by the year 2025 to keep it really short term by, let's say, 15 or whatever percent, just to put a number to it. You would then take that policy, which would be very concrete, very specific, and you would ask politicians around the world or even political parties around the world to sign up to that pledge. Is that how it works?
No, I'm glad you asked me that, Nico. No, that's not how it works, because what we're talking about are policies that would have to be implemented eventually simultaneously by all or sufficient nations. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen soon. It's a longer term objective, and I know time is short, but we need that cooperation, and we're not getting it now. That's why things are not happening now. So we don't have, Simpol does not consist of any specific policies at the moment. It is really just a pledge in principle that politicians and that citizens and politicians sign up in principle to it, and then the negotiations on the precise policies will happen nearer the end of the process, right? Because to actually say, to determine the policies now that might then only get implemented in 5 years or 10 years' time would be crazy for two reasons. One is the world's changing all the time, so it doesn't make sense to actually define specific policies today, which might be inappropriate tomorrow or in 10 years' time. And secondly, Simpol is democratic. If we define policies now, then people don't have a say. You're just asking them to sign up to something that they have no say over. So it's a much more organic process and a much more democratic process.
So can you just go a little bit into this? So what you're sort of saying is, so as a first stage, you're asking politicians, or indeed it's not just you, but anybody can ask politicians, every citizen, everybody can ask politicians to sign up to the Simpol principles. Yes. Once people sign up to the Simpol principles, they're kind of committing themselves to a process of negotiating a shared policy objective. And yes, it's in that process that they're setting the targets, that they're kind of agreeing on a roadmap, but they're doing this, as a kind of consensus building exercise.
Exactly.
And the end point of this would be then a policy that all the signatories to that policy have signed up to, and will then Absolutely. Come the next election vote on.
Yes, it would. Yeah, no. So that's right. But it's when as a citizen, when you sign up to Simpol, you're really telling politicians that I'm going to give preference to politicians or political parties that have joined the Simpol process by signing the pledge. Right. And because of that voting, that voting power, that's how we're driving politicians to sign up. Yeah. So those citizens in democratic countries have a strong voting power, but that power also gives them, or will give them, the opportunity to determine democratically what the policy content of Simpol should be. The Simpol doesn't leave the policy content up to politicians. We citizens can strongly guide that because of the power of our votes using the Simpol methodology, right? Now, from a politician, they've got nothing to lose because they know that Simpol will only get implemented if and when all the sufficient nations are on board. And until that time, there's no conflict between supporting Simpol and implementing their competitiveness-oriented policies that they have now. So for them, it's a win-win.
Can you give me a concrete example? Can you give me a concrete example of how this process plays out in the real world?
Well, I mean, I suppose in a sense you could say that if you look at almost any international treaty, it follows a similar sort of process. There's a need. The parties then sort of talk about, well, we have this need, let's sit down and have a negotiation.
Okay, but let me stop here.
And then if there's a successful result of that negotiation, then they get the implementation.
Yeah, okay, let's start at the beginning.
Sorry?
So you say there's a need. Who defines the need? Is it the citizen or is it the politician?
Well, in the case of a normal treaty, it's usually the politicians or the governments that do it. With Simpol, we citizens can define it, because the thing is that the kind of policies that Simpol would contain are the kind of policies that today's national politicians can't even think about, because their minds are stuck in this destructive competition sort of parameters, if you like. So,
give me an example of a policy that would, that would work, or a specific example where that process would work.
Okay, so the kind of example I would give, what would a simultaneous policy look like? So what I would suggest, you would have a climate agreement, much like the one they're trying to negotiate in Glasgow. But the important thing is, you would, on the other side, you would also have a global tax raising agreement to tax the super rich or the multinational corporations at a much higher level globally. Why? Because then the proceeds from the tax you can use to pay off or compensate the big losers on the climate part of the agreement. Now, this is another key thing about Simpol, is that it's a multi-issue negotiating framework, so that what a nation wins on the swing or loses on the swings, it can gain on the roundabout. One of the reasons we don't get any substantive agreement at these bloody COP things is because they're just dealing with one single issue, carbon emissions. And so there is no possibility of trade-offs. And that's why you don't, the losers, the big emitters have no incentive to cooperate. And, so the other point about Simpol is that it wouldn't be an agreement about targets. It would be an agreement about the actual policies that each nation will implement simultaneously to achieve those targets. So that it will have been pre-negotiated, so that every nation knows precisely what every other nation will be implementing, and that will have been agreed in the negotiation. Right now, you have this negotiation on targets, but because no nation knows what every other nation is going to actually do, everybody's scared of their competitiveness, and so nothing happens. So it's almost like if you could design a worse way, you couldn't really design a worse way of trying to solve climate change than the current COP process, in my view. And of course, yes, a multi-issue thing would be more complex, no doubt about it. But unless you have some kind of trade-off possibility, as a businessman, I just can't see how you're ever going to get a substantive outcome.
Okay, so essentially, what you're sort of saying, a couple of things would have to happen. There would be some kind of summit or some kind of international gathering of world leaders who would decide on, hey, we have an issue with be it climate change or be it financial regulation, because this is the other thing you're saying, it isn't specifically about climate change. It can be applied to any complex global challenge where you have to have simultaneous policy development and implementation. Yeah. So it could be a whole host of...
So what we're trying to do, Nico, just to give you so right now, the process of getting citizens and politicians signed up, this is like the in principle first step of getting people into the room, if you like, just in principle. Then when we have enough politicians and government, political parties and governments that have signed up, then we will start moving into the negotiating phase and the policy development phase. But right now we are just trying to get in principle support, because without that, I mean, you won't even.
Very true, very true. I'm just trying to kind of get a sense of the if you like, the kind of the journey that politicians would embark on globally with their, internationally with their colleagues, and of course, how would citizens? You've said this repeatedly, that there's a place in this for civil society. How is civil society going to engage with this process more meaningfully than it is today?
Yeah, well, let me first say, Nico, that if viewers go onto the policy page of our website, there's a download called the information pack. And in the information pack, there is a policy development section which will answer that question in detail, the process that we see by which citizens in democratic countries can have an input into the policy development process. So it isn't just decided by their government, that it's actually strongly influenced by citizens with the power of their vote to.
This is what I wanted to get to, because this is the critical point here, isn't it? Is that at the end of this process, somebody is going to say, well, this was a successful conclusion, and that's why we vote for you. Isn't that right? So there is a real carrot or stick attached to this process.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is when a politician or a citizen signs on to Simple, you sign on for life. You don't have to re-sign on at every election. And unless you want to cancel, in which case you just send us an email saying I'm cancelled. Nobody ever has, but it's a life choice in a sense. And so what we are doing is it transcends the electoral cycle, so that politicians know that there's this growing block of voters. Every election it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. All the time it's getting bigger, where they know increasingly that their electoral fortunes depend on them signing the Simple Pledge, right? And then when you get to the point where it's there's this negotiation and implementation, politicians will know that if they don't agree, if they don't reach agreement, or if they do reach agreement and for some reason don't implement it, they know that next election, they're dead.
That's the stick I'm talking about. So exactly. So there is a clear, it's a hard edge. It's not like, well, trust me, and well, if I'm not delivering,
absolutely no. I mean, we tell politicians when they sign the pledge, we say we will publicize your pledge to voters, our supporters in your constituency, your electoral area. And if you choose for any reason to cancel your pledge, we will also publicize that to all our members in your area. And, if you really want to hang yourself by doing that, that's your choice. This is what I mean, Nico, about us citizens. We have the power. With Simple, we have the power.
So basically what you're sort of saying, what you're sort of saying is, as a voter, as a citizen, when I sign up to Simple, I'm not signing up to a specific policy. I'm signing up to a principle. What I'm signing up to is basically, I'm signing up to a pledge that goes like this. Global decision-making relies on simultaneous policy. Unless we accept that, we're not getting anywhere. The politicians who accept that too are the guys that I'm going to be voting for, because only that way we'll be giving forward.
Strong preference to. Okay, that's just one important point, Nico, is that when citizens sign on to Simple, they're not signing away their vote. It's not saying, what it's saying is, as a supporter, I will give strong preference to politicians or parties that have signed the Simpol pledge. You know, it's not saying I will give you, you know, I will vote that way necessarily.
It's not automatic.
No, it's not automatic. So it still gives citizens, you know, citizens maintain their sovereignty as voters. And that's important, I think. But what it does do, because citizens are signing on to the campaign at any time, not just at elections, but at any time, it means that politicians know that they are more likely to get the votes of Simpol supporters if they sign the pledge. Okay, and that's the point. And so when the election comes, and it's almost a bit like having two votes. You know, when you sign on to Simpol, that's your global vote, and that already puts pressure, even outside of elections, that already puts pressure on your member of parliament or your political party to sign the pledge. But then when election day comes around, you get your national vote just like everybody else. And
that's right, because I think that's right. That's a really important point.
Although you will be more likely to vote for candidates that have signed the Simpol pledge, you are not, you know, you are not bound to do so.
So this is a really important point because, of course, and this is like it's sort of inherent in the system itself, or in the kind of in the structure of the thing. So local or national decision making will never carry a Simpol kind of, if you like, mandate, because for Simpol to actually kick in, you need a global consensus. You need it's only so you're sheltered at a local or national level. Simpol won't interfere with any political decision that that concerns the sort of the sovereign aspect of your vote. It's only in the kind of in the global environment, and it's interesting, I mean, because the global environment in the past in elections also has played sort of in fact, international politics, sort of foreign policy in general, has played a minor role in elections. And in fact, it tends to be the kind of the nice job to have, like foreign secretary. Compare that with home secretary. You're constantly in the firing line because everything goes wrong. Your home secretary, I mean, nobody ever sees you. You just go around in chats and have a good life. But I think this will obviously make the life of foreign secretaries and foreign ministers much more demanding, because all of a sudden they carry a mandate.
Yes, and I think though, as globalization is developing, and we're seeing this also now with COVID, more and more we are going to be hit by global challenges. Because we don't have a global governance system such as Simpol, and that's why I think the foreign issues or international issues are going to be increasingly important in elections, right? And so because these things are these international global issues are just hitting us one after another now. And so I think that's where Simpol will have an increasing power. But although I'd just like to say one thing, although I've sort of pointed out the enormous power it gives citizens to drive politicians to sign the pledge, what we find actually is many politicians just sign it anyway because they think it's a great idea. And even some politicians thank us. They say, well, thank you for developing a solution which solves this destructive competition dilemma that we're caught in. So I think we find that politicians are actually generally quite supportive of Simpol once we get to talk to them about it. But what we need is citizens to get the message.
That's right. So just to sort of summarize to where we've got now. So basically, you're sort of saying the first sort of stage of the kind of the development of Simpol was you reaching out to NGOs. That didn't really go somewhere. Then you just said, well, we have to sort of, to use a kind of an old-fashioned word by now, disintermediate. We have to go directly to the people who actually have to make decisions. We can't go via the kind of NGOs who have a lobbying role to play as well. So you went directly to politicians. What is your scaling mechanism for this, and how far have you got? I mean, I believe I read on your website something that you're on 100 countries. That's quite a success.
Well, we have supporters in about 100 or more countries. We have active campaigns in about 10 or 12 countries. And we have members of parliament signed up in about 7 or 8 parliaments around the world. So in the UK, we already have over 100 members of parliament and they come from all the different parties who have signed the pledge. In Germany, we've got about 40. In Ireland, we have about 15. So it's gradually growing. In Denmark, we have 1 or 2. In Australia, we have 4 or 5. So it's beginning to develop.
It's beginning, and of course, all the parties in these countries have their global networks. So you've got global conservative networks, global liberal networks, global sort of labor or social democratic networks.
Yeah.
And they, of course, they are potentially good distribution channels for ideas and
Yes.
the like. So it's going to spread out from there. So what is the next step now moving from here? Is it a question of more of the same, or what is your next big hurdle?
Well, we really need, the big hurdle is what I call consciousness, is people moving from a nation-centric understanding of the world to a world-centric understanding of the world. Because only when you have a world-centric understanding of the world will you even understand the dynamics of disruptive global competition. If you just have a national kind of view of the world, or even local, you won't even see it. You won't understand simple. So, there's a kind of consciousness issue. And so we're going to do more of the same. We're hoping, I think what I see happening, COP process, and it will keep on failing. It will keep on, it'll keep on being too little too late. And eventually politicians will realize that they need an alternative. And I think when that happens, we're going to see more of them signing on to simple, and hopefully then we will see more citizens coming, more NGOs beginning to realize that simple, I think things could really develop quite quickly. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. So I hope your viewers will definitely want to find out more and to get involved.
One thing that I always find really, really interesting, and also I think really quite important for anybody out there who is sort of trying to bring about change him or herself, and that's this whole thing. It's the sort of, when you had this idea, when your mum asks you, well, what about, what would you about climate change? This is like one man, in his, at his kitchen table with his family, sort of having this sort of eureka moment. And that's where a very long journey begins. I mean, you've been like on this for 20 years, and in my opinion, you have achieved an awful lot. But of course, as you said, there's still a massive mountain to climb. How do you do this? I mean, what are the kind of the human cost, if you like, for somebody like yourself? Because as you said, you're a businessman too. You've got family commitments. You've got all this other stuff going on in your life, and you need to make space for this. And presumably, you haven't made any money out of this. So
No.
how do you do it? I mean, what is your advice to other people kind of setting out on a journey like yours?
Well, for me, it's just conviction and also the evidence. I mean, on one hand, Nico, I wake up every morning and I sort of think, why are you doing this, John? It's such an impossible task. Why do you do this? Why do I do this to myself? But then, I switch on the news and I hear the evidence of failure of the current system. And then I look around and I see, well, can I see any other process or plan that makes more sense than simple? And I can't. And so I keep going. I just keep going. And the more time goes on, I mean, it's like going through a desert somehow. You are most of the time you're going through this barren landscape, but then every so often you hit an oasis where you get politicians signing up, or you get a really good result. Like, I mean, we just had the German election and we got a big increase in the number of MDBs who MPs, German MPs who signed up. So there are those moments of joy and yes, we're on the right track. But it's above all, this is about a change of consciousness. It's a different way of thinking. For the last 400 or 500 years, in the West, we've all been inculcated with the idea of the nation state and the power of the nation. And, we see this every day in football, international football matches or cricket or whatever it may be. But actually, we're now living in a globalized world. And that's a big mind shift for people, not only for politicians, but for citizens. And so I think the important thing about Simpol, the other point I wanted to make, Nico, is that Simpol only deals with policies that cannot be implemented by individual nations alone. Because those policies that can be implemented by individual nations, those are national policies. So they are within the national sovereignty area, if you like. The policies that nations can only be under Simpol, they would policies, the policies which are suffering from this first mover competitive disadvantage. And so only those policies would be admitted into the Simpol process. And that means they're protected on both counts, because it means that we don't encroach on national self-determination for those issues that nations can deal with alone, but we also offer a process to nations to allow them to deal with the other kind of problem that they can't deal with alone. And in that way, they win both sides. So actually, Simpol, in a funny way, enhances national sovereignty because it brings the power of the nation states up to the global level, provided they work together, right?
That makes perfect sense, John. Now, at the moment, COP26 is unfolding in Glasgow, and the world's kind of eyes are on Glasgow, and a lot of people, the young, but not just the young, are really hoping for some results. And indeed, there have been one or two smallish promises already coming out, and that's good. But of course, in the bigger picture, if it's really about averting climate catastrophe, it's clearly not enough. And we hear these noises on the sidelines already. The NGOs are piping up. And of course, if we fast forward 6 months, we probably find we could literally kind of have the same conversation, presumably in 6 months. I mean, as you said, I mean, we started to kind of recognize climate change scientifically as a problem in the early 1980s. In fact, probably even slightly earlier. And we've had ample opportunities to do things. But as you said, for very obvious reasons, competitive reasons and all the rest, little has happened. And there is absolutely no indication that this should change unless sort of a Simpol-like methodology is adopted. I mean, if we were to kind of say, well, let's talk again in 6 months' time, what would we be looking at? I mean, what kind of progress would we be expecting, say, on the Simpol front, but also in relation to, sort of society or civil society or the world at large?
Well, I think on the Simpol front, in 6 months, I mean, we tend to make the most progress at election times because that's when politicians are most sensitive to what we have to say. But I don't think there are any major elections coming up in the next 6 months.
Except the French elections, the presidential elections in France next year.
France actually is one country where we are really looking for some help. If you have any French viewers, we'd be delighted to hear from you to see if we can make an impact at the French elections. But so we're going to do more of that. I think you'll see more of the same on the Simpol front. But I think on the international affairs front, I think that we're going to see, the COP26 was too little, too late, the usual story. And I think, we certainly intend to write to MPs around the world, whether they are Simpol pledged MPs or not, to say, guys, how much longer, the emperor has no clothes. You guys following this COP process alone, you are looking increasingly empty-handed. You would be benefiting if you showed that you were supporting COP, but you were also supporting Simpol, so that you showed that you had more ideas rather than just this same old horse that they keep on flogging. So we are hoping that with that kind of pressure and information, that we can gradually bring more and more politicians and citizens to hear what we are saying. And ultimately, it's also a very forgiving message, I would say. It's not saying, unlike all these NGOs that are saying, oh, well, we're the good guys and politicians and corporations are the bad guys and the evil bastards. What Simpol is saying, look, yeah, there's some evil bastards. We know that. But generally speaking, we are all caught in this system at one level or another. And the sooner we stop blaming and shaming each other and start working together through a process like Simpol, the sooner we're going to solve these problems. So
one thing that's kind of been sort of like I've been mulling over thinking is if there was one platform or one personality or one who would that could make a significant difference to the progress of Simpol. Do you have any idea if you were if somebody would say, well, tell me one person or one organization you can pitch to, who would that be?
Well, I have a letter actually upstairs in my study from Sir David Attenborough, who I wrote to just a few days ago and sent him a copy of my book, The Simpol Solution. And he wrote back saying that it looked very interesting and he would be giving it a careful read. So if he got behind it, I think that would be one very good ambassador for the idea.
One platform that comes to mind where I think this particular approach would sit really comfortably, and that's the World Economic Forum and Charles Schwab, the founder and chairman. If you were able to pitch like in Davos in February,
I would love to, Nico. I would love to. Trouble is, unfortunately, I don't have the guys like Klaus Schwab have an army of secretaries to protect him against people like me.
Okay.
Our problem is how can we get the idea? How can we get the opportunity to present to the World Economic Forum, for example, or to any of these kind of fora? And that also is, we just haven't got through the glass ceiling yet.
Okay.
So our profile is still not yet high enough to allow us to have those opportunities. But I think if
this is definitely something
we'd have a good chance.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly enough, within the kind of the Reboot kind of 2030 family, there are like a couple of so-called young global leaders who are basically Schwab prodigies. And who have come through the kind of World Economic Forum kind of process. I mean, who knows if somebody watches this, and because I think, I mean, obviously you're a successful businessman, have been all your life. This is a clear, like sort of a business approach to improving the world. I mean, it fits in terms of profile. It fits 100% onto that platform. And surely it's something of its time. So I think it's worth kind of trying to think about pitching to them.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, Nico, if I can get an invitation, I'd be delighted to pitch to anyone.
Yeah.
The problem is how to get that invitation.
Absolutely. Listen, this has been really interesting. So I think what we should do is we should possibly kind of think of having another meeting in about 4 to 6 months time, and see. I mean, obviously, there may well, I don't know, you never know your luck, but there are fringe events as well in Davos. I mean, you don't necessarily end up on the main stage on your first visit, but there are fringe events, and there are sort of platforms where it's easy to get onto, I suppose. But you should really, I think you should look into this, and you should explore this, and maybe not aim for the main stage initially, but
no. I mean, just being in one of the fringe events would be fine. That would be more than good. And I'll have a look.
Definitely. Well, let's think about getting.
Nico, if you have people involved in Reboot who know the process, or know people, or know who we should write to, if you can give me any help with that, I'd really appreciate it.
I have that in mind. I keep that in mind. I can't make any promises because, sure, I might just be told, to go away, and how dare me, to even suggest it. So I can't make promises, but of course I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't have that thought in the back of my mind.
Okay.
So I think, in a way, I think the things that interest me is what could the journey look like over the next 6 months? I mean, you're sort of saying, France, it would be interesting, like country to get a sort of a toehold in. There's a French election coming up. Macron is under enormous pressure from the far right, as we all know. And Angela Merkel hasn't been too kind to him. I mean, he's been a great, he's put forward a great many reform proposals, every single one of which has been turned down by Angela Merkel. And it left him with a lot of eggs in his face. It didn't make him look good at all. And of course, he's quite vulnerable because of it, politically. So I think, like anything that can help him to reestablish. And then, of course, the Australia thing, that didn't help. And there's a lot of stuff where, like in the foreign policy domain, Macron hasn't been as successful as he would have liked to be. Also, given the fact that he is very much a foreign policy type, he's always been very interested in, European affairs, very interested in global affairs, and he hasn't had the breaks that he really, in my view, deserves. So it would be interesting to see, whether there's a way of pitching it there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all politicians, all the mainstream politicians, whether centre right or centre left, are struggling these days because of destructive global competition, which forces them into this, this straitjacket where voters start feeling, well, whoever I vote for, we still get the same thing, pretty much. And so I think that's why voters, are moving to the extremes. But of course, the extremes have no real solutions either, because the problem isn't at the national level, it's at the global level. And so I think that, if given the chance, I think someone like Macron would understand that very well, and would at least see the principle of Saint-Paul as something that well, I wouldn't say he'll support it, but he might at least find it interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there may well be other people within his party who are, are more focused solely on foreign policy, who might be able to kind of to give it greater thought. So I mean, I think what I find interesting, and what interests me in terms of like Reboot 2030 as well, is to sort of to follow people like you over a longer period of time, to see how things develop and what we can learn from both the successes and the failures, from the from the analysis and from the thought processes along the way. So if you were to kind of sort of think aloud about a roadmap ahead for the next 6 months, I mean, you sort of say more of the same, but there's specific things that might be interesting. One might be to get onto big platforms like Davos, but others might be to break into the kind of the French market, if you like, or into indeed, like I think Italy would also be quite interesting to expand there, because again, they have a major sort of far right issue.
Yeah, sorry, you froze for just a moment there, Nico. Sorry.
Oh, so in a way, like there's other European countries that obviously would also potentially benefit from it, and I was specifically thinking also of Italy, because again, it's quite a politically volatile country, and Saint-Paul could bring stability or some stability to it. And
of course, we could bring understanding. we could bring understanding, because I think, obviously until Simple actually gets implemented, nothing much will change. But I think at least with we can bring understanding to both right and left as to why things are the way they are, why they're so polarized. And I think that is almost the biggest contribution I think Simple, or a very big contribution that Simple could make. Because I think when you understand the way globalization and destructive global competition works, you see how that is driving this polarization, and that is driving these. It's no accident that you're seeing the far right coming up, not just in one or two countries, but right across the Western world, and that should tell us that because it's happening simultaneously across countries, it's a global problem. Hello, the source is coming from up there at the global level. It's not really down here at the national level. But until people understand how and why that's happening, and I think that's where my book, I think, would help people, then I think people start to see the world in a completely different way. And they can understand why.
You want to hold up your book for 1 second that people can see it?
That's the UK version, the Simple solution.
The Simple solution, and you get it on Amazon, or where would you get it?
There's a German one. It's Nationales Denken, Globale Krise.
Okay.
And then there's a Dutch one. I don't speak Dutch, Nico, so you can do that.
Excellent.
The is simple.
That's right. Brilliant. Okay, so how you have this different, is it chapters that you have in each country where you're active, or how's it organized?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So if supporters sign on and they want to do more than just sign on and contact their MP, if they want to actually get involved in organizing and developing the campaign, they might become the national coordinator or join the sort of management group in their country to take this forward in their country in a more concerted way. And so we have the global Simple website, but we also have national websites, because the Simple process can be adapted somewhat depending on the different electoral processes in each country. And I think the fact that we have MPs in the UK, which has a first past the post system, but we also have them in Germany, which has a completely different proportional system, shows that the Simple process is adaptable across different electoral systems.
As a matter of interest, are you in the US at all?
Well, we've got supporters in the US. We have a coordinator in the US, but that is a tough market. We don't think the US will be, in the first rank of governments to support Simple. So I think this is something start first in the European countries, then it will maybe spread out to the US and other democratic countries. And then eventually, I think if the process becomes more known, and if the UN process continues to fail, I think, non-democratic countries will also start to join the process voluntarily, because, they need solutions to global problems too. And so, who knows what will happen. I
mean, my sense is that, the more powerful the country, the less they would rely on a Simple type methodology. So the US, who perceives itself as a global leader, or the sort of sole global superpower, clearly doesn't necessarily perceive the need to have that.
Nico, that's true. That is true. But remember the presidential election of 2000 and also the recent one. These elections are being won and lost on very fine margins. Now, if you imagine if we had 5,000–10,000 Simple supporters in Florida and in the other key US states saying, we'll vote Republican or Democrat, we don't particularly mind, whichever signs up to Simple is more likely to get our vote. We could intervene in that very finely balanced seesaw quite powerfully with relatively few people. That's the potential power of Simple.
That is very true. That is very true. But yeah, the incentive, of course, then becomes a sort of electoral incentive at the national level. Globally, presumably, if you're the US, or say like on the other end of the scale, if you're China, then you probably don't perceive a need to do that. I mean, I'm thinking about small island states who will vanish in the next 50 years because the sea levels rise. They'll have a huge incentive, of course, to join, won't they?
Well, yeah, no, but on the one hand, you know, if Simpol gains citizen support, we could drive even countries like the US towards the other aspect we have to remember is evolution itself. You know, the global problems, you know, and the water level of global problems is rising and rising and rising. And the higher it rises, the more pressure there is for nations to cooperate. So a nation like, I don't know, maybe China or the US that we today see as being, no, they would not support this. Tomorrow, when the water's up here, you may find that they're singing a very different story because their survival will ultimately depend on cooperation. All of our survival will depend on cooperation at the global level in the end.
Yeah, and of course the other aspect is that within the kind of the Simpol family of nations or global politicians, there will still be elbows. There'll still be, you know, more persuasive, actors and less persuasive actors, and there'll still be horse trading going on because a consensus has to be found. So, you know, in a way, the backroom dealing isn't going to stop there, but what it does do, it kind of provides a structure for that backroom dealing to lead into a process that kind of, you know, creates a sort of a manageable situation at a global level. So, you know, a US or a China would still have significantly more scope to tweak a kind of a consensus building process in their interest than a small nation state, I believe. No?
Well, that's true. However, you know, there are more and more problems that even the most powerful nations won't be able to control, because even if there are some smaller nations that don't participate, they might offer businesses a better deal to come and locate there, you know, so, you know what I mean? I mean, I think in the end, we will reach a situation where, and this is, I think, where the evolutionary biology comes into it. You know, why do we have nation states today? We have nation states because the individual lender, like in Germany, or the sub-counties of nations, competition and the water level got so high that they had to cooperate to become nation states. And now we are today at the next level of that story where, you know, with climate change and COVID and all of these global issues, you know, nations are beginning to learn that, you know, like the different sub-states of Germany or the UK or Italy, that only together can we change our world.
Excellent. I think this is a very good point to stop. John, can you give us once more the website address for Simpol? Yeah. I mean, it's obviously it's also on the YouTube site and on our website, but just for the few to have it now.
Yeah, so it's Simpol. If you go to Simpol, SIMEOL, so that's short for Simultaneous Policy, simpol.org, and you'll find everything there. You'll also find all the different national websites and contacts. And like I said, if there's a country that doesn't have a campaign running, and if you're interested, or one of your listeners is interested in getting involved and starting one, I'd be delighted to hear from them.
And I think it's worth saying that you're still at a stage in your evolution where you're highly responsive to, you know, inquiries. So when people get in touch, they're kind of guaranteed a friendly and swift reply.
Definitely, yeah.
Excellent. John, thank you very much. We had slight problems, I think, you know, throughout, with the kind of the quality of your connection, but I was kind of monitoring it, and except for very few moments, you know, certainly your voice was quite clear. Sometimes your image froze, but I think we got really the vast majority of it we got.
Good. Yeah, well, I had to use my mobile hotspot for this because my normal Wi-Fi it's still out. So I think we did quite well in the circumstances.
I think we did. John, thank you very much. It's been a real
Nico,
pleasure.
thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And let's keep in touch.
Let's keep in touch and maybe think about another, like a sort of a continuation of this conversation about 4 to 6 months' time.
Yeah, be absolutely delighted.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Have a good evening. Yeah.
You take care.
Bye-bye.